Good morning, everyone. My name's Rami, and I'm going to be talking about developing with empathy. A little bit about myself. I'm currently a principal engineer at a startup in Washington, D.C. called Upside Travel, and you can generally find me on the internet as Necarus. Being a developer, as many of us are, I like to start with definitions. Start with understanding the situation, figuring out what the problems are, and then coming up with solutions and evaluating them. And I'm aware that what I'm talking about right now might seem like a solution, but I assure you, maybe you don't have this problem yet. Maybe you've had it in the past, but you don't right now. But I'd be very surprised if you don't run into some of these problems, and I'd love to talk to you about them. So let's begin in the beginning with an overview of the situation. I'm going to steal a few words from my fellow Washingtonian, Mr. Marvin Gaye, and hope that you can keep his smooth tones in the back of your minds for the rest of this talk, because he sounds better than I do. So in my years in tech, I've heard plenty of complaints. But there are a few themes that keep recurring. And I'm going to just say a few things that I've noticed and hope that some of these statements resonate with you as well. I look around myself at work, and I see mostly men. I'm consumed with dread every time I'm introduced to a new legacy code base that I have to add features to. I have junior colleagues at work who struggle to feel like they can contribute at all. I personally know more than one open source maintainer who is burned out completely from contributing. And I recently read that over 60% of the people, 60% of developers, I should say, from an underrepresented group in technology left their last job because of their work environment and the people they were surrounded by. That's a lot. So I'm not saying that the solution to all of these problems is a little bit of empathy, not by a long shot. But it does make us better colleagues, better open source contributors, and I like to think better people in general. So I'm saying we need to bring some of this to our work as developers. I found that different people think of different things when I say this word, so I'm going to go ahead and define it. According to the dictionary, empathy is being sensitive to and in tune with others' thoughts and feelings. And according to some pop psychology articles that I've read, we can break it down into 3 types. Personal distress is literally feeling another person's emotions. It's like when you're watching a horror movie and you see them go into the creepy house and you're thinking, don't go in there. Empathic concern is a little more what most of us think of when we hear about empathy. It's recognizing another's emotional feelings and being in tune with them. And of course, there's also a purely cognitive, purely logical way to practice empathy, which is where you understand where someone else is coming from, and from that you can infer their priorities and their concerns. So one last point of definition, or maybe a little reminder, we've all heard about this golden rule, which is cited in various places, and practicing empathy is actually a little bit different from that, because rather than focusing on what would meet our needs and projecting outwards, we try and focus on what meets those of others. Now, I understand. People are hard. And that's one of the reasons I became a developer as a career, and it may be true for some of you as well. But I want to remind everyone that it's not an innate attribute. This is a skill we can all practice, and it can actually make people easier to grasp and work with. Not to mention, like we just saw, there's a purely cognitive, empathic form that even Mr. Spock could get on board with. Now, an aside, I learned from the excellent book Brotopia by Emily Chang, which everyone should read, that a lot of tests that were developed for programming aptitude from the 1960s through to the 1980s featured this entirely speculative component about antisocial behavior being a good trait for programmers. I know, right? And that mental image has definitely influenced many of us, myself included, right, about what it means to be a good developer. And I want to remind everyone, let's not be hampered by these early guesses in the infancy of our field, and they were guesses, they're completely speculative. We're better than that. So what I think of when I think of empathy for developers is putting ourselves into another person's shoes when we're working with our code. So it's primarily cognitive, it's perspective taking, with a healthy dollop of empathic concern. Speaking of emotions, let's look at some code. How do you feel when you look at this code? I personally feel inadequate. I have to remember what a standard scalar is and what it does. And then I have to go back and rack my brain and think, what are z-scores again? And then I have to try and wrap my head around n-dimensional vector distance. And so, I get that. I work things out on a piece of paper, and I feel a little better eventually. That doesn't take away that feeling of inadequacy. So just raise your hand if you know that feeling. Whether it's z-scores in CS and statistics or z-indices in CSS, if you're not a front-end person, that's the kind of empathy I'm talking about. We've all felt that way at some point. So, it's not innate. It's a skill. We can all practice it. And these tips are a little bit generic, but I found them really helpful. But of course, the biggest thing is practice. Now, being curious about strangers doesn't necessarily mean talking to random people on the train. Right? I'm from the East Coast. I know how uncomfortable that is. Not to mention, I'm a straight cis man. I don't have a lot of security concerns that many other people do. But maybe interact with people that you rarely interact with at work. Maybe, try and go beyond, hey, the Rockies are doing great, to what brings them to work in the morning, why they're there on a particular day. Empathy is also a two-way street, and that means listening actively. In my experience, a lot of people in conversations, they're kind of waiting for their turn to say something. And building a little empathy means practicing telling that voice in your head to go shush. A trick that I've found really useful is trying to come up with a common feeling or experience based on what they're saying right at that moment, which kind of forces me to pay attention to what they're saying. And then you can come up with a common feeling and be open to each other and be a little bit emotionally vulnerable. That helps you to bond with someone else, right? And finally, there's expanding your circle of empathy. So going beyond the usual suspects, going beyond your friends, your teammates, try and take the perspective of someone you might consider an adversary. Now, I'm not expecting you to have a blood feud, right? If you're a Hatfield or a McCoy, you have bigger problems. I get that. But someone who you rarely see eye to eye with, anyone, like your landlord who won't fix your leaking roof, or the person in HR who won't approve your time off, or anything like that. Now, I'm going to steal an idea from our friends who work in product management and UX, because I think they're really onto something with their personas. If you find some of the ones that I'm going to put up helpful, then feel free to steal them or create your own. But these are just people you can imagine yourself working with as a developer. And I'm going to use them to demonstrate building empathy throughout this talk. This is Jin. Jin just graduated from a well-known local boot camp after a career in journalism. And he's very enthusiastic, but sometimes he needs a little hand-holding. This is Tiffany. Tiffany came to data science from astrophysics. So she knows pandas and NumPy inside and out, but sometimes she's thrown by Python features like generators that she doesn't touch very often. This is Tanya. Tanya occasionally dusts off her computer science degree and leaves questions on a pull request, but she spends most of her time getting her team the recognition that they deserve. So let's start with how we can bring a little bit of empathic thinking in our code itself. A thing that I regularly have to remind myself is that what seems clear as day to me is really kind of dark as mud to someone else. And to bring that back to our personas, something like a set comprehension that Jin might find really elegant is a little too dense for Tiffany to grok. And similarly, the NumPy broadcasting functions that Tiffany finds just so easy to understand are incomprehensible to Jin. Now, we all know about names, right? They're one of the two hard things in computer science, right? Along with cache invalidation and off by one errors. But they're also how we and our tools, like our IDEs, refer to things. And so they loom large in our experience. I want to start with them. This is from the SciPy source code. Any guesses what that 8th argument does? I have no idea. This is from a popular iOS library, AF Networking. Now, to its credit, the SciPy sample did have an enormous comment block explaining exactly what each parameter did, But looking at this, I find that I'd still rather work with this iOS example. And I barely know Objective-C. It's because, I know what the method does. I know what all of its arguments mean. I can just look at it. So let's bring it back to Python. Put yourself in Tanya's shoes and look at these lines of code. Imagine living in a world of Jira tickets, surfacing only to glance occasionally at your latest team pull request. So you look at that in a diff. How are you going to feel? Maybe a little lost. Maybe also a little worried that you feel lost. Well, how about now? I don't know about you. I feel a lot better. I'm like, oh, I know what that does, sort of. So I'm saying, if we can let a little bit of that empathic approach guide us when we're choosing names to start with, then we end up with happier colleagues and more maintainable code. I'm not going to go into this way too much, but the TLDR is, at least in my opinion, they're not for you. Like, who's totally comfortable with this higher order React component? Raise your hand if you are. I'm not. OK. How about this slightly magical JSON decoder? OK. So let's put our empathic hats on. And let's think of Tiffany looking at this code, because maybe it was written to pull data into a model that she built. I'm kind of tensing up. Right? Are you? I mean, she has to look up the JSON module documentation for the slightly obscure object pairs hook argument. Then she's got to refresh her memory on regular expression syntax, which, as we all know, is the clearest of things. And then she has to remember what the star operator does when you apply it to a list comprehension, which, it's kind of syntactically awkward. It doesn't look obvious. It's kind of difficult. And I just want to remind everyone, right, to someone on your team, you're going to be the guru on a particular piece of code, and they can learn from you. Use that opportunity. Like I said, I'm not going to go into this too much. There's lots of strong opinions out there. Commenting too much, commenting too little, sometimes not even at all. There's lots. But please watch Veronica Hannes' talk on this subject, because she takes a much more in-depth look at it. She actually surveyed a lot of developers and found that most people said comments help them remember what their code does, helps them clarify their thinking, and helps current and future developers save time. Don't we want that for our teams? I know I want that for my team. Also, some people may be familiar with Antirez, the chap who wrote Redis, has a very descriptive blog. He goes into 9 different types of comments and why he likes each one. Also worth a look. But watch Veronica Hannes' talk first. We also, we don't spend all of our day in text editors. So much of our day involves working sort of near, but not actually in code. So let's talk about that for a second. Many of us have seen or heard of Tim Pope or Linus Torvalds in their exhortations about how to write good git commit messages. If that's your kind of thing, more power to you. They might be worth reading. I personally find it more useful to remember what good git commit messages are supposed to be. They're supposed to tell a story that the code can't. The circumstances and the reasoning behind each change. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of Jin. Let's say he's looking through the set of changes that make up a feature, or even worse, he's using git bisect to hunt down a bug. How do you think he's going to react when he sees a commit message, which might even highlight the source of the bug, that says, fix it? I'd be exasperated. I'd even be a little bit angry. And eventually I see enough of that and I just get exhausted. And working with exhausted people, not super fun. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but I do have a few sets of tips that I took from various blog posts. And fundamentally, I like to think about the questions that Tanya would be asking. She'd be saying, OK, why did we need this change? How does it do what it does? Are there any side effects? And also, whether you use Jira or Trello or GitHub Issues or whatever you use, links are great. They provide us a lot of context. So I've got a couple of links myself. The top post link here is where the tips on the last slide actually come from. It's definitely worth reading in its entirety. And coming back to it, I actually have it bookmarked. But if you like tools, then there's a Git message template here from thoughtbots.files repo, which is super useful. There's also a project called Commitizen, which helps you be a good citizen with your commits. It's a clever name. In my opinion, the most effective thing, though, is this last tip. Coach your team to avoid git commit -m. Because at least I have found it way too easy to use that command line option, bash a few keys, and call it a day. And every time I'm tempted, I think about Jin in the middle of a bisect, faced with, WASD. And I try and think again. That's all well and good, Rami, you might say. But who uses just git commit messages these days? I do everything in GitHub or GitLab or whatever platform you may use. I don't really think that changes things. Personally, I use GitHub at work. I use it for most of my open source interactions. And I feel like it's the same text that's there. It's conveying the same meaning. And it's just as helpful to me to figure out if an open source library included a bug fix in its latest release from the commit messages as during a bisect in some internal project. Plus, in a web interface, you can add screenshots. I like screenshots. Now, of course, we can't miss perhaps the most important part of web-based code tools, right? That's where most of our actual discussions around the code come from. And we all have to remember, it's a thing I have to remind myself of regularly, that when we're reviewing someone else's code, or when we're responding to reviews of our own code, or when we're triaging an issue, or reporting an issue ourselves, inevitably there's another human being reading something that we're putting out. And so if we put ourselves in Tiffany's shoes, right, and imagine a scenario, right? She's a little peeved that you haven't included basic null checks in a dataset loader that you wrote. And you're inclined to just close that discussion and be like, it's not necessary. Whatever, we're fine, I checked that. Or she leaves a wall of text in an issue because she's really excited about a new convolutional neural net technique that she's been developing. And you can't really be bothered to hear about it because it's not really your thing. Whether we're met with resentment in the former case or disappointment in the latter, either way, it's not a great emotional state to leave your colleague in, and a little empathy can avoid a lot. And while we're talking about GitHub and comments and issues, let's take a moment to empathize explicitly with the open source maintainers that spend so much of their time on their triaging issues and reviewing code and often getting no thanks for it. Give them a second. They deserve our empathy more than most. I'm not going to beat the proverbial horse here. Scott already mentioned in the intro Eric Holscher's stuff about read the docs and write the docs. He and many others have given better talks than I could on the importance and ease of adding documentation. But let's put our empathy hats on and imagine a scenario with Tanya. She's trying to help her team out and knock out a simple API integration. Easy enough, right? But there's no internal documentation. So she has to clone some code, set up an environment, get it running locally just to figure out what arguments to pass to this method. What constellation of disgruntled feelings is she going to be experiencing? I felt annoyed, and then confused, and then really stupid, and then kind of smug, and then anxious, all in the course of trying to figure out one library function. So even if you can't stand your internal wiki, we use Confluence at work, and I can't stand it, right? But put up a couple links. And also, to take it back to the previous slide for a moment, if you're a creator or user of open source software, and we kind of all are, then your Git commit messages and your GitHub PR discussions, they are documentation, right? Because they're public and they're searchable. And someone is inevitably going to come across them when they're Googling something. But most of us also spend a lot of our time interacting with other folks in real time throughout the day, not just plowing through an endless sea of code and documentation, as much fun as that might be. So what role can empathy play in a casual conversational forum like Slack, beyond the role it plays in actual face-to-face conversation? Now, obviously, as with any direct interactions between people, there's an endless number of ways we could practice empathy in this scenario, but I'm going to highlight one. Links. Links are kick-ass. Links are wonderful. Links help Tiffany here remember the details of a bug that she didn't write. Links show your teammates what you're working on. Links and the ability of platforms like Slack to show previews, critically, they reduce the cognitive load that we have to face when we're dealing with a new context and give us the confidence to make intelligent decisions. I was reminded recently that while most of us in the world and academically recognize at this point that people have different learning styles, as developers, we still mostly cater to visual and sort of text-based learning, even though people may be auditory learners or kinesthetic, hands-on learners, or lots of other things. So when I talk about whiteboarding, I'm not talking about interviews, right? That's a whole nother talk. But what I am talking about is using whiteboards to help us communicate more empathically, to reframe the conversation more visually or more kinesthetically as an interactive story for people who learn and work better that way. So, for example, Tanya here, our team lead, she's an interactive learner. She can't really feel the impact of an optimization we made to our cluster's performance until we've diagrammed it out together. Even though maybe to me, it's plainest when I hear the numbers recited. Now, I recognize this is hard for larger teams or remote teams. When I worked remotely and we had team get-togethers, we'd spend a lot of our time at whiteboards. It was as if we were making up for lost time, which seems to underscore that you should do it when you get a chance. As a bonus, a whiteboard session provides an explicit forum for explanation and for discussion. So where a shyer colleague may feel it's appropriate to ask a naive question, or a more assertive colleague's statements can be diagrammed out and analyzed just like everyone else's. For a similar reason, I'm a big fan of these informal team tech talks at work, because not only is it a good way to reframe the conversation for more auditory or interactive learners, but it has a bonus effect of formalizing and spreading some knowledge and leave some artifacts behind because you've got the slideshow. Like, in this case, our junior dev, Jin, might feel more confident with public speaking because of his background in journalism. And so the tech talk is a great way for him to level up on a topic and gain confidence in leading a discussion. Now, we've gone through some things that can go well, but it's also worth a quick rundown of a few things I've seen that don't work so well, or sometimes are actively against empathy with our fellow developers. Like this attitude of strong opinions loosely held. I've heard this called the worst idea in tech, and I'm kind of inclined to agree, because from what I understand, it means you can make unequivocal, bombastic statements with some sort of implicit shared assumption that you'll change your mind in a heartbeat if you're given new data. And it's supposed to lead to a collegial environment in which ideas get a vigorous defense. Isn't that such a lovely idea? Oh, yes. In my experience, if there's any power differential or personality difference involved, like let's say one person's a little more senior than another, or one person's a little quieter and someone else is just a little louder in their style. And I've seen that dynamic especially true for underrepresented groups in technology. Well, that breaks down completely and it shuts down the discussion and, the loud person wins. That's not a collegial environment. Like, in the example, Tiffany doesn't feel like she can contribute anything in a lot of discussions because the people around her just sound so sure, even though she's got lots of data to back it up. And a trick that I found useful and is a good one to coach that I learned from a blog post is to qualify all my strongly worded statements with a percentage confidence. Like to say, I'm 97% sure we should not use MongoDB. I'll be honest, I'm more than 97% sure. But that provides our data scientist in this example, who actually has data to back her answers up, room to argue. And it makes me think, how confident am I before words come out of my mouth? Who hasn't been tempted to say, oh yeah, if something goes wrong, just come talk to me, I'm right over here. I mean, it sounds so welcoming, right? You're inviting someone to come talk to you. And it's so much easier than writing something up, it's easier to explain in person, you might say to yourself. Or you have that lovely whiteboard diagram that you came up with when you were working it out in the first place. And who reads the documentation anyway? And meanwhile, you have your team lead here left not wanting to bother you, even though she does have a problem. Because, well, you said if there's a problem, come talk to me. And that kind of implies that there shouldn't be a problem. And so maybe she did something wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. And your time is valuable, and she knows that. And in my experience, again, when someone takes me up on this and comes to talk to me about something, it's all flown out of my head by the time they come to talk to me, or I realize there's so much context that I haven't explained, and it takes longer. And then I was busy at the time, and I'm completely derailed afterwards. And in the meantime, my team lead here is feeling really helpless before a meeting with senior management. Now take a second and think about that, feeling helpless before your meeting with senior management. That's really not a pleasant feeling. I don't want to think about it too much. It's not something we want to inflict on our teammates. A trick that I've used is when I don't want to explain something properly, I imagine that I've been granted a 30-second audience with Master Yoda to explain it. And I just jot down what comes out. And more often than not, I'm way too embarrassed by the result to actually want to put that in any public place. So I clean it up. But even if I'm not, it's a lot better than nothing. Now, we've also all heard that most of communication is nonverbal. Text has no tone. It's really easy to miscommunicate. That's all true. It also creates, in my opinion, the biggest empathy gap, because you can read anything into a message based on your emotional state. I know that's true for me. Like Jin here doesn't know how to call out a senior colleague on their mistake, so he agonizes over every word in a comment on a pull request because he doesn't know how to defang everything with a smile. And I'm not going to suggest that we should immediately stop doing anything remotely and start doing everything face-to-face in an office, because that's really inefficient, it's limiting, doesn't fit how many of us work best. But we should fully use the media we have, video calls, quick phone calls. One that might be a little controversial, emojis. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to use this real quick. But I learned from a book by a guy called from a guy called John McWhorter called Words on the Move about how emojis play the part of pragmatic markers in language these days, how they form the winks, the tones of voice, I know, right, the filler words. And they're super easy, so we should use them. Enable our textual language to be a lot richer. In a dry run of this talk, I was asked if someone could use GIFs or memes. You can. I'm meme challenged. I prefer not to. The final one that I want to bring up is too many templates. I've seen well-intentioned formula like this so often. Security checklists, JIRA tickets, pull request templates. I see them backfiring all the time. Please don't overuse them. But to sum up, empathy is not innate. It's a skill we can all build with a little practice. There are lots of places that we can and we should apply it in our everyday work, and we need this in our industry. Finally, if you've really enjoyed what I've been saying and you want a minute for senior management to build empathy in your team, the Harvard Business Review says to do it, right? That always convinces the C-suite. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you try at least one of the things that I've mentioned. And I don't have time for Q&A, but I'd love to come talk about this anytime afterwards. Please come find me. Thank you.